There's a lot of disruption happening around the world today, and particularly in the realm of economics as Donald Trump reshapes the U.S. economy and as Elon Musk attempts to solve the labor problem. Here to help us sort it all out is Dr. Steve Hanke. Dr. Hanke, I've seen a lot of CVs in my day, but I don't know when you've had time to eat. You're a distinguished scholar with the Mrs. Institute right there next to Georgia at Auburn, Alabama. And you have been a fellow at the Independent Institute of Oakland, California. You also were a senior advisor at Renmin University of China's International Monetary Research Institute in Beijing. It goes on and on. You've advised presidents, you've served on the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors for Maryland. I mean, it's a two-page CV. It makes me feel small. I've got to expand mine.
I think I'm older than you are, John.
Not much. No, I think we would probably be labeled contemporaries. So, one thing I would really like to get into with you is through your work with the China International Monetary Research Institute in Beijing. It is my belief that we are at war, and I mean that literally, with China.
Well,
And General Robert Spalding, a retired general with the Air Force, has written a book called Stealth War. Peter Schweitzer has written two compelling books called Red Handed, and the last one, I can't remember, I'll come up with it. And then Gordon Chang has written another book about overarching influence in our country by China. You couple that with 150,000 military age fit men that have crossed our southern border from China, along with enough fentanyl in our nation to kill every living American, and a spy balloon that hovered over our most sensitive military bases. I could go on. This is your interview, so I'll stop. But it really concerns me. What insight do you have, and do you share my concern about China's influence and overarching grabs inside our country, like 300,000 acres of farmland around our military bases? This is serious stuff. What do you think?
well, so just one thing, and speaking of time, I am speaking to you from Baltimore today, not Beijing, and
Yes.
I'm a professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, but and I'm in my 56th year. So, as I said, I've been around a lot longer than you have.
Well, I'm
So,
72. I don't think you look
well,
that much old.
I got you by 10 years.
All
So,
right. Well, you'll be my new big brother that
yeah, okay, good.
I yearn
At any
for.
rate, let's pivot to China.
Yeah.
I think most people don't realize that we are at war with China, meaning the U.S. has declared war on China. So, and this is gradually crept into the system, but was enunciated pretty clearly in the Biden administration. And you have a whole phalanx of neoconservatives who are just dying to wind things down in Ukraine and the Middle East and pivot to China. And so, so I see it maybe through a little bit different lens than you do. There are always two sides to coins, and and one side is the U.S. and the U.S.'s de facto declaration of war against China. So there is, and that comes from a variety of sources. But one thing that it comes from is something that in economics that's completely misunderstood, and that is that we have a trade deficit and also a current account deficit in the United States. We've had one every year since 1975, and a lot of people think that trade deficits are bad, uh, and that they're caused by nefarious activities of foreigners. And when I was on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors in the 80s, if you go back that far, the big problem, the big enemy was who? Japan. Japan was the one that was forcing through nefarious activities, unfair trading practices, all of these things supposedly, the Japanese were causing the trade deficit. That now, of course, the thing has shifted, and although Japan does fill some of that deficit, the big filler is China. And so all fingers are pointed to China from kind of an economic point of view, forgetting the military part of the thing. And this is just incorrect. The reason we have a trade deficit is due to the fact that the U.S., we spend more than we produce. And the gap between what we spend and what we produce is a trade deficit, and it's an identity. It happens to exist because it's a true identity. And who causes it? Americans cause it because they spend more than they produce. Now, what do we have?
Yeah, can I just ask you to clarify that for a second? Is it because we spend more than we produce, or is it because we buy more than we sell? And is it not a fact that China has limitations on what we can sell inside its country from the United States, whereas we don't have those same limitations?
We have the same. We have the same kinds of controls. But
well, we have the potential, but do we exercise it?
Oh, yes, we do.
All right. Well, enlighten us.
There are many things that we restrict trading on with China. For example, just something you read about all the time in the press are chips. High quality chips. That's one restriction. But let's first get to the economics, because people do not understand, and your response to what I said indicates a part of the confusion.
Okay.
Spending is what? Spending is consumption,
sure,
plus investment, plus government spending, plus an X, and the X is the balance in the international account equals GDP. So this is what everybody learns in Principles of Economics 101. Consumption plus investment plus government plus X, which is a foreign account, equals GDP. Now, if you have consumption plus investment plus government that exceeds the value of GDP, X has got to be a negative. That's the identity. And X being the negative, that's the trade deficit. So it's just arithmetic. And the causation is, in fact, by the U.S. Now, another way to think about it, and another identity, is the savings investment identity. And we actually save less than we invest in the United States. This is another way to get at the problem. And that this savings that we have, or deficiency in savings is less than investment. And that means we have to have a trade deficit to fill that gap, whatever the deficiency number happens to be. And if you look at your national income accounts and go through this consumption plus investment plus government plus X equals GDP, you get the numbers, and they're very easy to see what the numbers are. It always balances. It's just accounting.
Well, now, aren't there some economists that do not include government spending in the GDP because the government doesn't produce anything? They just spend money.
But they spend though, and it's counted in the national income accounting, and the way GDP, the gross national product, is defined. It is defined exactly the way I've given it to you: consumption plus investment plus government plus X, the foreign account, equals GDP. So that's just
okay. That's just connect the dots. How does
the definition of GDP?
How does that relate to our trade deficit with China? That's where I'm a little lost here. Is President Trump, does he just have it wrong?
He
says that we've got a massive trade deficit with China. We're basically helping to subsidize their economy in doing so.
No, he doesn't understand anything about this. It's completely wrong.
Okay.
Completely wrong. For the reason that I've just given you. Just let me go over here just a second.
Now, we had Bob Lighthizer on our program. He's written a book called No Trade is Free. I think he would probably challenge your paradigms as well.
Well, Lighthizer, of course, doesn't understand anything else about it either. Lighthizer never learned. I was going to get the numbers
And what
for you,
about
but
Secretary Ross? I watched him on. Uh,
Ross has got it wrong too. Ross doesn't understand it either.
well, no disrespect, Dr. Hanke, but
These are basic
is it they've all
principles.
got it wrong, or that you just disagree with them? I
No,
mean,
they've all got it wrong. This is an identity. It's a truth. It has to be true. They don't understand it. If you ask any professional economist trained in economics, you would have 99.9% of them agreeing with what I'm just saying.
well, we just
Whether
had on.
whether they're on the left, on the right, in the center, it doesn't make any difference.
What's the guy's name we just had on? We had on one of your colleagues from the Mrs. Institute just earlier today, um, Gary Gallus. He is at Pepperdine, where he teaches economics. And he has a slightly different perspective than what you've articulated. I want to challenge you on one other thing that you indicated. I have to take strong exception to the part that you referenced relative to our restricting China from buying our chips. There's a good reason for that, isn't there? That they reverse engineer and steal our intellectual property, which they've done for the last 20 years.
This wasn't the reason for this is not economics and not logic. It's national security. Anytime
Yeah.
you wrap something in the flag, the logic disappears. There's nothing you can argue with. If you say, they're going to drop a bomb on you unless you do this, you agree and say, I don't want the bomb dropped on me. So
Okay, so do you challenge
let,
that we restrict their use of our chips because they
no, but
reverse engineer
no.
them?
You started with a falsity. You made a false statement. Now John. You've got a program. It says truth.
Yeah,
So we have to.
I'm
We
trying
have
to
to
get
tell
to
the
it
truth.
right now.
And the truth is that we have restrictions. You asserted we have no restrictions on China, and I said no. That's
Well,
not
I
the truth.
stand corrected. You pointed out a very good example of where we absolutely restrict trade from China.
Yes.
And I'm
Yeah.
saying that this is for a very good reason that
Well,
they're stealing our intellectual property.
uh, uh,
Do you disagree
okay.
with that?
For whatever reason, but we started with the premise that you held, and the premise was that we are the angels. We don't do anything wrong. We're clean as a hound's tooth. This is just garbage. And going back again to economics, let's talk about the trade war that we're in. You said we're in a war with China. I agreed. We're in a war with China, and it's basically in one aspect, and the aspect that I'm an expert on and can talk about is economics. I'm not in the Department of Defense. Now, you want to get into the Department of Defense. I'm not in the Department of Defense.
Well, I'm trying to look at the whole picture, and I don't know that you can look
but
at an economic war and separate it from what we see with our very own eyes: spy balloons traversing our country, military-age men illegally crossing our southern border, 7 or 8 Chinese police precincts spread throughout the country from New York to Los Angeles. Fentanyl that has cost the lives of
you want to
tens of
enunciate
things of Americans.
what we do in China?
I would like to hear, because I am interested.
No,
in
I mean,
sure.
things are a little bit more symmetrical than you think. You, you don't think the U.S. is doing anything in China? We don't have any satellites looking in on China and so forth. So let's talk about the economics just a little bit, because the trade war and Trump's tariffs, or the threat of tariffs, are a real issue. I'm not only an economist, but I'm actually a realist, and we're talking about tariffs and tariffs supposedly will solve this trade deficit problem, which is a problem. Number one, the trade deficit is not a problem. It's a good deal for the Americans. Americans actually can spend and consume more than they produce. That's a good deal, and it's been easy for us to finance it. Why do you think it has existed since 1975? Because we can finance it. And why can we finance it? We've been able to finance it because the US dollar is the king. It is the only international currency. It's the top of the heap. And it allows us the privilege of being able to finance a big trade deficit without any pain whatsoever. The money comes into the United States. Foreigners want to invest. They want to be holding assets that are denominated in the US dollar. So it makes it very easy for us to finance a deficit. If you were in a developing country or an emerging market country, John, as they say, that you might have a big problem if you're running a trade deficit for a long time, because there might be a sudden stop of capital wanting and being attracted to coming in to your country to finance the deficit that you were running. And if that happens, you have a huge currency crisis. These happen all the time. We don't have a currency crisis. We just keep financing the thing. So trade deficits are not inherently bad, and in fact, they've been very good in the United States. They have been caused by Uncle Sam. They're made in the USA. That Japan and China, the only thing they're doing is filling the deficit, and that deficit would be exactly the same if China didn't exist, John, because the deficit would be filled by somebody else.
Well, that's fine, but I keep coming back to the point that, all right, let me ask you this way. What about the EU? Do you feel like the same logic applies to them? Now, we created intentionally trade deficits with the EU after World War II so we could help rebuild Europe. Those policies don't really seem to have a place in 2025 because the EU's population is slightly larger than the United States and their combined GDP is only slightly less than the United States. So has the purpose for having subsidized the EU, does that still, how does that factor into your analysis? And then the other 170 countries around the world that we're subsidizing?
It's basically what they say a second order condition. The first order condition is how much savings are being done in the United States versus investment, or how much spending is being done relative to GDP. And when we were in the Marshall Plan and so forth, we were running a surplus. It was the other way around. We were spending less than our GDP, and we had, instead of having a negative in that X, we had a positive. So it was another ball game, and we also were actually savings more than we're investing. Now the savings more than we're investing, the way to get a handle on that is that the big dissaver, the thing that contributes to dissavings in the United States, and the fact that savings is less than investment, is government deficits. If we wanted to balance the trade account, if we thought that was a good thing to do, it would be very easy to solve. You just balance the federal budget, and you would tend to shrink that trade deficit almost immediately, and fundamentally probably would disappear. At least given the recent calculations I've done on this. I have an article in the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance published in 2009, where Ed Lee and I actually, for the first time, go through all the numbers for the savings investment identity. And it turns out that the private savings in the United States are actually greater than private investment. Where you end up with a deficiency that overwhelms that surplus in the private sector is the public sector. The public sector runs deficits. They dissave. and that contributes mightily to the trade deficit that we have. Now, the question that really you're getting into is, well, who's going to fill the deficit? You don't like China, okay? So let's say that you prohibited everything coming from China. You'd still have the trade deficit that would have to be filled by somebody, and it would just be other countries.
Well, I have no bias against China. What I have a bias against is the things that they are doing inside of our country, and we are seemingly asleep at the switch on it. And it's not a notion that I have invented. Again, Peter Schweitzer, Robert Spalding, Gordon Chang, three pretty reliable and respected journalists, authors, have made me aware of these things. So that is my concern. Let me ask you about the deficits. I've got this notion that it would be really bad if we just with the stroke of a pen decided to balance our budget in a really short period of time. It's my observation that when our country gets in economic trouble, the first thing we do is we start printing money by the truckloads, and we call it stimulus. Well, isn't the corollary if we stop the deficit spending and suck that money out of the economy, like $2 trillion, would that not be recessionary? And would we not feel ill effects from that if it weren't done with a lot of intention?
No, you wouldn't do that at all. It depends on number one. In general, it would be at this stage. It actually would be a stimulus because the conventional view and what people learn in principles economics, they learn Keynesian economics, and Keynesian economics tells you what if you run a deficit, you have a Keynesian multiplier that's attached to that, and it multiplies. It stimulates. If you run a deficit, it stimulates. But that's not really what you find. If you look at the data, again, as a realist, you find that if deficits run over about 3 or 4% per year, which they do now in the United States, they whack confidence, and they make those deficits turn into negative Keynesian fiscal multipliers. So they actually slow down the economy. The deficit we're running now is not stimulating, it's dragging. And you can get that by listening to people like Jamie Dimon and president of J.P. Morgan or many other people in the financial sector who are worried about what? They're worried about the deficit. A lot of people are worried about the deficit. Why are they worried about it? Well, intuitively, they understand what I just told you from a technical point of view. And from a technical point of view right now, the deficit's dragging the economy. And that it's dragging it because instead of a positive Keynesian multiplier of being applied to the deficit, you have a negative. And the reason it's negative is because of confidence, business confidence.
People consumer confidence.
People are afraid. You're running this big deficit.
Well, shouldn't they be afraid when the deficit is $36 trillion and the interest on that?
They should.
Hang on. And the interest on that debt is our second largest line item in the federal budget today.
It's 13%. So of government spending. So, and it's spending for nothing basically. What do you get by paying interest? Do you get any service from the government? Do you get any goods from the government? You get nothing from the government.
Well, that's the argument I was making earlier about including
no,
you
GDP. Were making the opposite argument.
No, I've said no. That's not accurate at all. I said that a lot of people do not consider government spending part of the GDP because the government produces nothing.
No, but
now you're agreeing with what I said earlier.
You're jumping onto a different stool here. You started this last chat that we've had by saying, wouldn't it be a bad idea to shrink the deficit down to zero fast?
Now, I'm not advocating that at all. I would like to see us have a balanced budget. I'm just asking you out of intellectual curiosity. If spending money when we in bad times is a stimulus, why would not be constricting government spending therefore be the opposite? That would be
Well,
deflationary. And I
this
just
what
said,
I
wouldn't it
this
be
what
a
I this what
kind of
I
a
told
balancing act that we'd have to
you.
engage in?
This what I told you.
I heard you.
We're running a big deficit that's a drag. It's not stimulating. It's dragging the economy.
I'm willing to accept your interpret your uh,
And, and by the way,
perspective.
the only way to solve the thing to my satisfaction would be to cut government spending, and that doesn't seem to be in the cards. Both parties, the Republicans and Democrats, are just as bad when it comes to controlling government spending. They're spending like drunken sailors. Look at this big beautiful bill that they have in there. They they that bill contains what? It contains
Pork.
increased government spending. A lot of pork. There's no question
And
about
that's
that.
why Elon Musk was upset at President Trump. He said that you've obliterated all the work we've done at Doge because you're just spending.
Well, he's that's why Musk is right. Musk
Yeah.
is the richest guy in the world because he can add and subtract. And by the way, that was a big contentious issue with the president, and because the president really doesn't care about spending. But
Well,
that's
my interpretation is that he understands the art of the practical, and that in order to codify the 2017 tax cuts and to get the new tax cuts that he wants, he's going to have to placate the people that want to spend until the next budget go around. Now I could be wrong, but that's how I read the tea leaves.
but my reading of him now, as well as the first term, is that one area he doesn't really care much about is the government budget. There's not much focus on controlling the government
Well,
budget.
we have found a source of agreement because you can't argue with that. The government was expanded under Trump 1.0, and he's shown no determination to curtail it so far 6 months into his current administration. I agree
So,
with you.
so,
Disappointingly.
so, so, so we do have a good point of agreement now. Let's follow up this point of agreement with how can you actually solve the thing to satisfy Gordon and Hanke? And the only way to do that is to have a constitutional convention, Article 5 of the Constitution, and change the US Constitution so that it reads like the Swiss Constitution, which was changed in 2001, in which the Swiss debt brake was put into the Constitution. They had a referendum in Switzerland. They had a huge majority that wanted the debt brake to be put in the Constitution, which they did. Now, what's the debt brake say? It says that the budget must be balanced in Switzerland, point number one. And it says that government spending in Switzerland can't increase any more rapidly than the real growth in the economy. So that means that in Switzerland, the government can't get larger relative to the total economy's total size of the economy than it is right now. It could get smaller, but it can't get bigger. So that's the only solution, I think, John, because these band-aids that occasionally we've tried to put on the budget through statutory means to control it. They remember the Graham-Rudman bill. That was a band-aid. It was a good band-aid. It worked for a while, but they figure out a way in Washington D.C. to tear the band-aids off.
Yeah, we put debt limits in place to curtail spending, and we can just raise the debt limit.
So exactly. So the only way you really can do this thing is a constitutional change.
Well, I know who we could get to lead it. I'd start with Rand Paul and Ron Johnson. I bet you they would sign up for that
Well,
task.
we to do this, we have to have 2/3 of the states agreeing to have a convention, which in principle they already have. The problem is the Congress has ignored their request for a convention. And why has the Congress ignored their request?
Because California and New York have more votes than most others.
They don't want the Constitution to change and they don't want a straitjacket to be put on government spending.
Yeah, and if you called a constitutional convention, there's a good likelihood that another amendment would be term limits.
Well,
That
no.
would be my guess is why they don't want a
Well,
convention.
the convention can be confined to only looking at the budget.
Yes, I agree.
In other words, a lot of people argue, oh, we can't have a convention. It would be a runaway convention, and they would redo everything in the Constitution. No, you can have a very limited scope of debate about what issue it is that you're going to focus on with regard to changing the Constitution.
All right, now you've written a new book called Making Money Work: How to Rewrite the Rules of Our Financial System. Tell us about the book, and sounds like you have some rewriting to do.
So, well, I don't have any rewriting to do in the book. It
No,
just
not in
came
the
out.
book. I'm saying just for our economy.
Yeah, well, there is quite a bit. But let me make the kind of 3 points that that we make in the book that I co-authored with Matt Sikorski. One is to bring back the quantity theory of money as the the model for national income determination. Now, what that means is that the national income determination, the nominal GDP, which includes a real component, real growth, and inflation. If you add those two things together, you get nominal GDP. And to determine nominal GDP, you have to look at changes that have occurred in the money supply prior to today's date when you're looking at the nominal GDP. In short, if you want to forecast where nominal GDP is going, where inflation's going, where real growth is going, you have to know what's happened to changes in the money supply prior to the date that you're forecasting or the date that you're looking at the nominal GDP. So that's one thing. The second thing, and this is a big deal because the Federal Reserve dismisses the quantity theory of money. Chairman Powell says, and he's testified over and over again, that changes in the money supply have no reliable relationship to the economy and to economic activity. That's just not true. But that's the Fed's position. And of course, without the quantity theory of money, what have they given us? A roller coaster ride in the money supply, up, and then we get inflation, and then down, and we get inflation starting to come down. So that's the first overriding point of the book. The second point is that since the great financial crisis in 2008, commercial banks have been kind of squeezed out of the system. We had Dodd-Frank legislation. We had new capital regulations coming from Basel, Switzerland. Those have all been imposed on banks, and banks have been kind of squeezed out of the system. This has been bad because banks produce most of the money in the economy. About 80% of the money supply, measured broadly by M2 or some broader measure, is actually produced privately by commercial banks, not the central bank. So we want to change the rules so that some of these regulations are lifted off or modified as they affect commercial banks and commercial bank activity. That's the second point. The third point is the objective of monetary policy should focus on what we call neutrality. If you put money in the system, it's not neutral. And to give an example of how this works, in the United States, before the pandemic, in January 2020, billionaires' wealth as a percent of GDP was about 14.1% of GDP. Now, at the start of this year, it was 21.1% of GDP. Billionaires' wealth as a percent of GDP. So money is not neutral. What happened? Why isn't it neutral? If you have the money supply being goosed, asset prices go up. That's the first thing that happens. So land prices go up, real estate prices go up, the stock market booms. And who owns the assets? Well, rich people own the assets. Poor people have balance sheets that are negative. Actually, they don't have any net assets.
Sure.
They have negative.
Well, don't
So
you think?
what has happened? This last thing through the pandemic, the Fed goosed the money supply, and they also created huge wealth and income inequality in the United States, which is bad.
I agree. Don't you think this trend towards consolidation has contributed to that immensely? I mean, the media in this country is controlled by basically 6 or 7 corporations. The pharmaceutical industry has gotten so consolidated that, and you talk about banking. My dad was a community banker. You can't find a community bank anymore. They've all been bought up.
Yeah, the community banks are going by the wayside,
Yeah, and
unfortunately.
not in a good way.
Well,
So
not yeah, in a bad way, because
yeah,
who who actually, just think about it in a realistic, practical way. Who the key thing in a bank is to be able to assess credit risk and credit quality.
yeah.
Well, who can do that better than a good old boy running a community bank?
Who know
I
the
mean,
people?
you know very well, a community banker knows what he knows everything that's going on from the bedroom to the downtown Main Street, and you have to know all those things if you're going to be able to assess credit properly and credit risk properly and make a loan. And what happens when you make a loan? You make a loan to John Gordon to do something, and you know what the credit risks are associated with Gordon, and what does Gordon have to do to get the loan? You've got to put some assets that you have up against that as collateral. So and what happens with the creation of the loan creates money, because that loan does what? It goes into Gordon's credit checking account, and checking accounts are part of the money supply. In fact, the biggest chunk of the money supply are liquid deposits at commercial banks, including obviously community banks or commercial banks. They're
Sure.
just they're just small ones.
Yeah. So Jerome Powell, good for our nation or bad for our nation? I mean, could you make the argument that he's done a pretty skillful job of taming inflation while not sending us into a recession? Would you
No,
concede that?
I would say he's been one of the worst chairmen we've had. He's had us on a roller coaster. He created a huge inflation boom because he ignored the quantity theory of money. And then he had to put everything in reverse. And the money supply actually is about the same today as it was in April of 2022, which means that we'll end up going into recession later this year because we haven't had any money growth.
That's not a very optimistic outlook. I'm sorry to hear you say that. What do you think about Scott Bessent as Treasury Secretary? Maybe he should be the next chairman of the Fed.
Well, Bassett is getting passing grades from the market, but he's basically a cheerleader for the president. So he's echoing whatever the president says, and the big thing that's disrupting the international economy is trade, and Bassett is saying the same stupidities that Trump is. And he said last week the next thing to sliced bread is going to be stable coins. Now that's just promoting Trumpism and putting a lot of money in Trump's family's pockets. So that's a crony capitalism kind of thing.
Well,
It's
maybe he likes job security. I don't know.
well, I think that the courtiers around kings always like job security.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that goes with the territory. I mean, the president installed him in that position, and I think that he has should have a reasonable expectation for loyalty. But I'm sure they mix it up behind closed doors and can have frank conversations.
We don't know.
Well, we know that he mixed it up with Elon Musk pretty good, and we saw how that turned out.
Yeah, we did, and I think I think Musk was on the right side of the argument.
I 100% agree with you. Dr. Steve Hanke, uh, just a really interesting and fun interview. Dr. Hanke, usually they're a lot less contentious, but that's all right. I mean, I think contention is a good way to get to the truth,
Well,
frankly.
that's what that's
And
it.
I have an open mind. I want to receive the information that you've delivered today, and I'm going to think about it. And I'm particularly going to check your definition of the GDP because I went to the penultimate source of knowledge on the internet, and nowhere do they tie government spending with GDP. But you've sent me on a mission. I'm going to go
Just
dig deeper.
as we wind up, go to any principles of economics. You really have to be careful with the internet. As I always tell my students, my 95% rule holds. Hanke's 95% is 95% of what you read on the internet is either wrong or irrelevant.
Good note to end on, Dr. Steve Hanke. And I hope you will come back.
I say I'm all for getting at the truth, and I've enjoyed immensely having a chat with you today. It's been shall we say, stimulating.
Well, that's the whole point, and hopefully for our listeners, entertaining as we come to you every Saturday on the John Fredericks Media Network in 7 cities on 22 AM and FM stations, on the CDM Media Press on their 13 digital platforms, and all across the World Wide Web on YouTube, X, Getter, Rumble, Facebook, and others. Dr. Hanke, thanks a lot. Have a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you, John. All the best.